It's hard to believe, but a little over 6 months ago, Final Fantasy XVI just released. And now we're already speculating on who could be the one to work on Final Fantasy XVII. Will it be yet again Creative Business Unit 3 and Naoki Yoshida? Well, today he's got some really fascinating comments about that. So you're gonna want to hit that subscribe button because we're gonna be covering Final Fantasy XVII just like we covered every other title before it. So recently, Shuhei Yoshida spoke with Naoki Yoshida on Final Fantasy and asked him whether or not he would be the one to work on Final Fantasy XVII. Here is what YoshiP had to say. After hesitating because he's on the board of directors now, he skirted around the question and offered that maybe it's time for someone new instead of having the same old guys handle the next one. He then continued, "I think in some ways it'd be a good look to the future and bring in a younger generation with more youthful sensibilities to make a new Final Fantasy with challenges that suit today's world." This is something that I really agree with, actually. The series has been led by the old guard for quite some time now. You have many of the same familiar faces that have been working on these titles for years and years and years. And I think this is both true on Creative Business Unit 1 and 3. Probably a little bit more true on Creative Business Unit 1, but definitely also true of Creative Business Unit 3 as well. I mean, for example, Hiroshi Takai was also someone who worked on Final Fantasy V. He's someone that's been at Square for a really long time. So I do agree that it'd be really interesting to have someone who's young, who kind of grew up playing Final Fantasy rather than played an active role in making it. Because I think that there is an entirely different perspective when you have someone who is working on a long-running series like Final Fantasy, who grew up playing it versus someone who has worked on it for years, right? A prime example of this would be one where the Creative Business Unit 1 guys were talking about how with Final Fantasy VII Remake, actually a lot of the younger staff wanted to make sure that the story didn't deviate too far from the original because of this sort of respect and reverence that they had for Final Fantasy VII. Whereas someone like Kitase wanted to go in there and make more active changes to the story and the gameplay structure, etc. I guess what I'm trying to get at by making this sort of example is to say that younger people who grew up with the series have a sort of different connection with it and might be able to connect better with the current existing fans than maybe the old guard could at this time. I also think in terms of game design, and this is where things get pretty controversial, Final Fantasy XVI really didn't modernize very much. Their definition of modernization there just seemed to be action combat and modern day PS5 quality cutscenes. But in terms of questing, interactivity, how to really engage the player in the world outside of just playing a cutscene, there were a lot of choices in that game that felt archaic, and honestly, it's not just 16. There were definitely these issues in, say, something like Final Fantasy 13, and when it was compared to contemporary RPGs, it didn't really stack up. I think Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is finally going to get to the point where outside of just modernizing combat and cutscenes, they're going to actually improve the way that you interact with the game and make something fully engaging in that way. Because combat is just one element of an RPG, right? It's not the whole game. In fact, to me, what kind of defines an RPG is the multiple ways in which you do approach interacting with it. It's kind of a unique genre in that sense. And I do think that someone who's younger, who's played a lot of RPGs growing up, would also be able to take what these newer modern RPGs do and apply them to the identity that Final Fantasy has that is truly modern and up to the standards that we expect in this day and age. YoshiP was then asked what advice he would give a younger Final Fantasy XVII director. The famed producer preceded his answer by saying, "Final Fantasy is about challenging what's been done before." And it's for that reason he pondered the possibility of two very different Final Fantasy XVIIs. While I'm certainly not looking to pick a fight with the older games, we all make Final Fantasy games thinking, mine will be the most fun. So my advice is to just dive in and first put down on paper what you believe would be the most enjoyable Final Fantasy before thinking too hard about it. You know, as Kitase and YoshiP have said before, Final Fantasy should be the game that the developer thinks is the best game that they can possibly make. He then continues saying, then from there, you decide things like, since Final Fantasy 16 was a real-time action, my Final Fantasy is going to be both real-time action and turn-based battles. Or you could go the other extreme and return it to its fully turn-based pixel art roots. To that last option, Shuhei Yoshida replied, "That would be groundbreaking." Now, as the article mentions here, this is not the first time that YoshiP has teased the idea of Final Fantasy XVII being a pixel game. I actually really do not think that this is a bad idea. In fact, I think that they actually should make Final Fantasy XVII a pixel game. Part of the reason I think that they should do that is that there is still a huge hunger for the traditional Final Fantasy style. I've often talked about potentially breaking this series up into two different series, continuing the main numbered entries with the action FF7R style combat, while also offering a turn-based spin-off, I don't know, Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals, which would be not necessarily a AAA game, and it offers stylized graphics. Maybe it looks something more like a Dragon Quest XI instead of a Final Fantasy XVI, and it would be traditionally turn-based. It could probably run on the Switch, which is really popular in Japan, and sell plenty of units, all while still pushing AAA fidelity with Final Fantasy mainline. Personally, I think that's exactly what they should do. And also, since they have a really friendly relationship nowadays with Hironobu Sakaguchi, I think it would be incredible if they were able to get Sakaguchi to direct one last pixel art Final Fantasy. That thing would sell like hotcakes, and it wouldn't even cost them that much relatively to develop. They would be able to get that game out in like 2 years. And the article even mentions here that you could do the HD 2D style that's been used in Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy and the Dragon Quest III remake. That would be awesome. Dude, I think people would absolutely love that. I also think too, with Final Fantasy's identity being so tenuous nowadays, that a pixel art Final Fantasy XVII could allow them to re-identify with traditional Final Fantasy in a way that I don't think anything else can. Not even necessarily remakes, right? Because with remakes, say like Final Fantasy IX remake, which everyone kind of theorizes is going to be a lot more of a traditional remake than say Final Fantasy VII. You don't necessarily have to imagine a new world. You have to reimagine the existing world. A pixel art game would allow them to imagine a new Final Fantasy world while also having the restrictions of keeping to traditional Final Fantasy. Trying to capture the spirit of what people love about the series and creating something new which is so at the core, at the heart of what FF is, while also maintaining its own style. Now, despite all this, I want to be clear, as I've talked about before, I think Final Fantasy can and should go anywhere. It should always go into new territory. But I think the most important thing that is going to help not just Final Fantasy, but I think it's important to any series, is having a firm identity and saying that we are this type of game and we're going to make the best style of this type of game that we possibly can, and we're going to find new ways to iterate on it and to improve it. And I think one of the issues that Final Fantasy has gotten itself into is that because of this lack of identity, it's tried to do and be all of these things, and because it never sticks to them, it never really forms as the new identity of Final Fantasy. It just kind of becomes the thing that Final Fantasy is going to try this week, rather than the thing that Final Fantasy is going to be from here on out. No one would say Final Fantasy 1 was the best turn-based system, or Final Fantasy 4 the best ATB system, if you want to put it that way. They just kept going and making that better. I think gameplay styles are really hard to just knock out of the park. You know, in the same way, I don't think that most people say that Demon Souls was the best Souls game of all time. They took that concept, that identity of what a Souls game was, and then they improved it, and that's how we got to Bloodborne. And so I think that's kind of what Final Fantasy needs to do. I think a pixel art game is a great way to get in touch with the roots of Final Fantasy and to satisfy those who have maybe felt disenfranchised with where the series has gone in recent years. And ultimately, it would be a good thing to put in between Final Fantasy 16 and the next big AAA Final Fantasy, which would be 18 if this does happen. Hopefully, this is a real thing coming, YoshiP. I'm too excited for it. I want a brand new, modern Final Fantasy pixel art game. Don't you dare play with me. But these are just my thoughts. Please let me know yours in the comments below. And if this channel has provided a lot of value for you, be sure to click that join button and become a channel member or join my Patreon. Link in the description below. And I'll see you all in the next video.